On an ordinary summer afternoon, Jessica Carter, a 70-year-old black woman, left her modest home on Chestnut Street for a simple errand: to buy milk and bread from Mike's Market. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows on the concrete as she walked through a neighborhood that no longer felt like hers. Once filled with familiar faces, warm greetings, and children playing on the sidewalks, the streets had now been overtaken by gentrification, glass storefronts, boutique cafes, and people who walked past her without even seeing her. Jessica, once a respected teacher and community figure, had become invisible in the very place where she had raised her son, buried her husband, and built a life of quiet resilience. She moved slowly, her knees aching from years of arthritis, gripping her small purse tightly, not out of fear but instinct. Her only goal was to complete her errand and return home. Inside the store, as she reached for a carton of milk, she noticed a young man in a hoodie slipping energy bars into his pockets and dashing out the door just as the alarm blared through the building. Before she could even process what had happened, a tall man in a navy polo, an off-duty police officer, stormed toward her with accusation in his eyes. Without evidence, without question, and with complete certainty, he grabbed her by the arm, demanded she empty her pockets, and ignored her pleas of innocence. The store owner, Mike, who had known her for years and could have spoken up, remained silent. No customers intervened. Phones recorded. Whispers filled the air. Jessica, stunned and terrified, was handcuffed and led out of the store like a criminal for simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time. At the police station, the humiliation deepened. No one checked the cameras. No one asked for her side of the story. They fingerprinted her, took her mugshot, processed her like a common thief, and tossed her into a cold holding cell. There, she met a young mother arrested for stealing a granola bar for her hungry daughter. In the shared silence of injustice, Jessica reflected on a life spent doing everything right, following the rules, raising a good son, believing in the justice system, only to be discarded when it mattered most. When given the chance to make one phone call, her heart battled with her pride. Her son, Jamal Carter, was no ordinary man. He was the U.S. Attorney General, the nation's top law enforcement official. Calling him could solve everything, but she feared the consequences. Would she be seen as weak? Would this tarnish his image? Would they say he only fought for justice when it was personal? She almost refused to call, but in the courtroom the next day, sitting beside a tired, disinterested public defender and facing a judge who barely acknowledged her existence, she realized she couldn't win alone. When the prosecutor claimed the store security cameras had malfunctioned, and her own lawyer shrugged helplessly, Jessica finally asked to make the call. Moments later, Jamal entered the courtroom, tall, composed, powerful. The energy shifted instantly. No longer just an elderly black woman on trial. She was now the mother of the Attorney General. Jamal's voice was calm but authoritative as he demanded to see the surveillance footage. The prosecutor tried to deflect, but under pressure, finally admitted the cameras had been working all along. The footage was played, showing the real thief sprinting away while Jessica stood, unaware, simply holding a basket. The silence that followed was suffocating. The judge dismissed the case, and Jessica was free, but she felt no triumph, only exhaustion. The courtroom had only listened because of who her son was. Outside, reporters swarmed. Headlines exploded. Attorney General's mother wrongfully arrested. Public outrage followed. Investigations were launched. That evening, sitting by the window in her quiet home, Jessica held a cup of tea and thought about everything she had endured, not just the past 24 hours, but the silent battles of a lifetime. Then the phone rang. It was Jamal. His voice, steady and strong, held a promise. "Mama, I won't let this happen to anyone else." And for the first time since the nightmare began, Jessica felt something stir deep within her. Not anger, not bitterness, but a fragile, flickering hope. After the courtroom doors slammed behind her, Jessica Carter sat silently in the car beside her son, Jamal Carter, the United States Attorney General. her wrists still sore from the tight zip ties that had cut into her skin just hours before. The media frenzy outside had been overwhelming, flashing cameras, shouting reporters, a whirlwind of attention she never asked for. Her face, aged by years of quiet dignity and now tainted by a system's failure, had become a symbol, a headline, Attorney General's mother wrongfully arrested. But inside the stillness of the vehicle, there was no sense of victory. Jessica didn't feel relief, only weariness. Her body ached, not just from the cold metal bench or the humiliation of being dragged through the legal process, but from the emotional weight of understanding that justice had not freed her, power had. Jamal, usually so composed, sat beside her in quiet anger. He had watched the court twist itself into knots the moment they realized who she was. The judge who wouldn't look at her suddenly became attentive. The prosecutor who had lied about the footage stuttered apologies. Everyone shifted their tone, not because the truth had changed, but because her son had entered the room. Jessica had taught Jamal from a young age about fairness, about decency, about believing in the system. She had raised him to believe that doing good would lead to good outcomes. But today proved the opposite. Today proved that even a lifetime of integrity meant nothing when your skin was the wrong color and your status wasn't immediately visible. Back at home, Jessica walked slowly through her front door, the creak of the wood beneath her feet somehow heavier than usual. She sat in her favorite chair by the window, hands wrapped around a mug of tea, watching the city breathe outside. Everything looked the same, but nothing felt the same. She thought about the young mother in the holding cell, locked up for stealing a granola bar to feed her child. Would anyone come for her? Would anyone believe her story? Jessica doubted it. Her case had caught attention only because her son had power. Without him, she would have been just another file in the system, another elderly woman discarded and forgotten. Days passed, but the story refused to fade. News outlets replayed the surveillance footage. Commentators debated racial profiling. Social media exploded with outrage. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse. Within a week, an internal investigation was launched into the judge and prosecutor's conduct. And yet, none of it felt like justice to Jessica. The system wasn't changing, it was reacting, trying to save face. One night, as she sat flipping through channels, she paused on a news segment about her story. There she was on screen, handcuffed, confused, humiliated, and Jamal at her side, commanding the room, demanding accountability. The host called her an icon of quiet strength. But all Jessica felt was a deep sadness. They had turned her suffering into a narrative. But the pain was real. The shame was real. Later that evening, Jamal came by to visit. He sat across from her, silent for a while, then finally asked, "Do you regret calling me?" Jessica looked at him, her son who had risen so far, who had fought so hard, and she shook her head. "No, baby," she said quietly, "I regret that I had to." That night, they talked for hours, not just about the case, but about the system, about the countless people without connections, without powerful sons, who never make it out. Jamal listened more than he spoke. His expression hardened with resolve. "This won't be the end," he finally said. "This will be the start of something." Jessica didn't need promises. What she needed was change. But for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to believe it was possible. In the weeks that followed, Jamal launched a review of racial bias in arrest protocols, expanded oversight on low-level offenses, and demanded mandatory body cam reviews for any contested arrest. Jessica didn't want to be the face of a movement. But if her pain could prevent someone else's, then maybe it meant something. Sitting by the window once more, watching the city pulse with life beneath the streetlights, she felt a shift, not in the world, but in herself. She no longer believed that justice would always find the truth, but she had seen what could happen when someone refused to stay silent. And that, perhaps, was a start. In the weeks following her wrongful arrest, Jessica Carter became a reluctant symbol of a broken system, a woman whose dignity had been stripped in public view, only to be restored not by justice, but by power. Her face was splashed across newspapers and nightly broadcasts. But none of the attention could undo what had been done. She had spent 70 years walking the line, following every rule, teaching her son to believe in the system, only to be betrayed by it in the most humiliating way. And yet, in the silence of her home, away from the noise of the cameras and protests, Jessica remained grounded, not bitter, not angry, just deeply reflective. Every knock on the door, every call from a reporter, every invitation to speak at a forum reminded her that she had been heard only because of who her son was. What about the others, the ones still behind bars, whose stories would never trend, who would never get the chance to be saved by someone in power? That thought haunted her far more than the memory of cold cuffs on her wrists. Jamal, for his part, had followed through on his promise. He initiated federal inquiries, forced local departments to review body cam policies, and called for legislation that demanded review of video evidence before charges could be filed in low-level offenses. He stood before Congress and told them about his mother, about how easily the system had tried to swallow her. But Jessica didn't want to be a footnote in a political campaign or a rallying cry for reform. She wanted real change, quiet, deliberate, permanent. She began writing letters, not speeches, not public statements, just handwritten notes to women she had met in the holding cell, to advocacy groups working with falsely accused individuals, to lawmakers who had reached out. Her words weren't angry, they were purposeful. She wrote not to tell her story, but to amplify others. She didn't want pity, she wanted prevention. One morning, she received a letter in return. It was from the young mother she had sat beside in that cell. The woman wrote, "Your strength gave me mine. I fought my case. They dropped the charges. Thank you." Jessica sat by the window, tears in her eyes, not from sadness but from a quiet sense of purpose. The world outside still moved on. Cars rushing down Chestnut Street, people passing by with coffee in hand and headphones in their ears, unaware of the storm she had weathered. But inside, something had shifted. She was no longer invisible. She was no longer waiting for fairness, she was helping shape it. Occasionally, Jamal would visit late at night, the weight of his title evident in the slump of his shoulders. He would sit at the kitchen table, sip tea, and talk not as the Attorney General, but as her son. They spoke about reform, about policy, about the human cost of broken systems. He listened more now, really listened, and Jessica, once hesitant to burden him, realized her experience was not a weight, it was a weapon. A truth that could no longer be ignored. Months passed. Investigations led to disciplinary actions. The officer who arrested her without cause was suspended. The prosecutor who had concealed evidence faced censure. Judge Mercer quietly resigned under pressure. Small victories, not justice, perhaps, but accountability. On the anniversary of her arrest, a community center invited Jessica to speak. She declined. Instead, she asked for the platform to be given to someone still fighting their case. She attended quietly, sitting in the back, watching as a young woman shared her own story with trembling hands and a steady voice. Jessica smiled, not because the world had been fixed, but because someone else had been heard. That night, back at home, the city's lights shimmered in the distance. Jessica wrapped herself in a soft shawl, her hands warm around a cup of tea. The scars of her experience hadn't faded, but they no longer burned. They had become reminders, not of pain, but of power, not the kind that comes with titles or influence, but the quiet, relentless power of truth, of courage, of refusing to stay silent. As she looked out into the night, Jessica Carter no longer wondered if justice existed. She knew now, it had to be demanded, defended, and sometimes carried on the shoulders of those who had suffered. And in her heart, beneath the pain, there was finally peace. In the months that followed, Jessica Carter's life quietly transformed, not in grand gestures or headlines, but in the subtle, powerful way a person carries the weight of injustice and refuses to let it define them. Though the world had come to know her as the mother of the U.S. Attorney General who was wrongfully arrested, Jessica had returned to her quiet home on Chestnut Street with a deeper awareness. A sharper sense of the world she had once believed in so faithfully. The neighborhood, now fully wrapped in the gloss of gentrification, moved on as if nothing had happened. Shiny cafes stayed full. Strangers walked their dogs past her home, and her small porch remained a place of stillness amid the blur. But Jessica had changed. Her mornings, once spent tending to houseplants and reading the paper, were now dedicated to correspondence. Letters came in daily, from strangers who had seen her story, from women who had suffered similar fates, from young activists asking for advice, from prisoners seeking hope. Jessica read each one slowly, carefully, with a pen in hand and patience in her heart. She responded to as many as she could, not with long speeches or declarations, but with warmth, honesty, and a quiet kind of strength. "You are not forgotten," she would write. "Your story matters. Keep going." It was not the life she had planned for this chapter of her years, but it was a life that felt full of purpose. Meanwhile, Jamal Carter found himself changed too, though he had always fought for justice in courtrooms and congressional halls. What happened to his mother brought the battle home in a way that left a permanent mark. The woman who had packed his lunch and prayed over his test scores had nearly been crushed by the very system he had sworn to uphold. And so, Jamal began to listen more, to ordinary people, to public defenders, to community leaders who had long warned that the system didn't work equally for everyone. He launched a new initiative to review wrongful arrests, partnered with local governments to fund better legal representation for low-income defendants, and advocated for real consequences when officers violated rights without cause. He no longer spoke of justice as a lofty ideal. He spoke of it as something fragile, something that needed protection. He called his mother every Sunday, no matter how busy, and often came to sit with her on her porch, where they would talk not just about policy, but about life, about family, about staying grounded. Jessica never asked for praise, and Jamal never gave speeches about her strength, but in their silence was a shared understanding. Something bigger had begun. One afternoon, a young woman knocked on Jessica's door, nervous, respectful, and holding a small notebook. She had been working on a research paper about racial bias in the justice system and wanted to interview Jessica. At first, Jessica hesitated. She was not a scholar, not a speaker, just a retired teacher who had endured a terrible mistake. But something in the young woman's eyes reminded her of the students she once guided, the ones who needed encouragement, who needed someone to believe in them. So she invited her in, poured tea, and began to speak, not just about her arrest, but about her childhood, about raising Jamal, about the quiet ways black women carry the burdens of dignity in a world that tries to strip it away. The girl listened intently, took notes, and when she left, she hugged Jessica gently, whispering, "Thank you, I'll remember this forever." That night, Jessica sat by the window, the city glowing with streetlights and stories she'd never know. She thought about all the lives that intersected because of one terrible day. About the strangers who found courage in her silence, and the voices that had finally begun to rise. She no longer needed recognition. What she had now was far more powerful, a role in a movement not built on noise, but on truth. She thought of the women still sitting in holding cells, of the mothers who never got to make that one phone call, and of the people who still believed justice was only for the powerful. And with every breath, every letter, every quiet act of defiance, Jessica Carter vowed to keep proving them wrong, not through anger or bitterness, but through grace, through presence, through refusing to disappear. She had once walked into a grocery store for milk and bread and left in handcuffs. But now, she walked each day with purpose, not to reclaim what was lost, but to light the path forward for those still waiting to be seen. Time passed, but the memory never faded, not from Jessica Carter's mind, nor from the consciousness of a nation that had watched her humiliation unfold and redemption arrive only when power entered the room. She never saw herself as a hero. She never asked for sympathy or fame. What she wanted, what she had always wanted, was simply to be treated with the dignity every human deserves. Yet even in the stillness of her home, she understood that something irreversible had shifted. Her life had become a reference point in classrooms, in courtrooms, in political debates, in conversations whispered between mothers and sons. She would overhear people on the bus discussing her case, sometimes getting the details wrong, sometimes romanticizing her courage, but she never corrected them. She had long understood that stories took on lives of their own once they left your hands. What mattered to Jessica now wasn't the retelling of her story, it was what others did because of it. One quiet Sunday, she visited the small community church she had attended for over 40 years. As she entered, people rose, not in ceremony, but in silent recognition. The choir leader gave her seat in the front row. Children, once rowdy and restless, sat with straight backs, eyes wide, aware that someone in their presence had endured something important. The pastor, moved by her quiet return, set aside his prepared sermon and instead spoke of injustice, resilience, and the obligation of community to protect the vulnerable. Jessica didn't cry, didn't speak, didn't need to. Her presence said everything. After the service, one elderly man approached her with trembling hands and said, "They've done it to me too. But no one believed me." She placed her hand gently over his and replied, "I believe you," and that, more than any lawsuit or political hearing, felt like justice to her. Meanwhile, Jamal continued his fight on larger stages, testifying before committees, calling out systemic flaws, pushing legislation that bore the fingerprints of his mother's story. His words were fierce but grounded in something personal. He no longer spoke like a distant official. He spoke like a son who had watched his mother suffer because of silence, and who now refused to be quiet. He often quoted her in meetings, "Justice should not depend on who you know, but on what is true." Behind every policy he pushed was a memory of that courtroom, of his mother's shaking voice, of the prosecutor's lies, of the courtroom's cold indifference. Jessica watched his speeches on television but never commented. She knew Jamal needed to walk his own path, just as she had walked hers. Occasionally, he would ask her if she wanted to attend a press conference or sit in on a roundtable. She always smiled and said, "No, baby, I've said enough. Now it's your turn." Still, she remained active in her own way. She met with mothers whose children were incarcerated for petty offenses, sat with families who had been ignored by the justice system, and offered not legal advice, but something often more valuable: presence, listening, understanding. People didn't come to Jessica for solutions, they came for the comfort of being seen, for the assurance that they weren't alone. One afternoon, while walking through the market where it had all begun, she noticed a young cashier nervously glance her way. He was new, unfamiliar, but clearly recognized her. As she approached to pay for her items, he stammered, "Miss Carter, I'm sorry about what happened. That should have never." He trailed off. Jessica smiled gently and said, "Thank you, but let's make sure it never happens to anyone else." It was not forgiveness she offered, it was accountability wrapped in hope. As she exited, she looked back at the store, not with bitterness, but with calm awareness. It would never be just a grocery store again. It was a landmark now, not because of the milk or bread she never got to buy, but because of what had been taken and what had been reclaimed. That night, she sat once again by her window, city lights flickering like distant memories. She wrote a letter to herself, not for publication, not for Jamal, not for history books, just for her. It began simply, "You survived." And it ended with, "And now, you help others survive too." As the clock ticked into midnight, Jessica Carter, once invisible, once accused, once silenced, sat still, strong, and deeply rooted in a truth the world could no longer ignore. As time unfolded, Jessica Carter's story didn't just echo through legal chambers and headlines, it quietly rooted itself in the lives of people who had never met her. Her name had become more than a case, it had become a symbol whispered in courtrooms, written into essays, etched into community circles that had long felt unheard. Though she had never set out to be an icon, Jessica understood now that what had happened to her wasn't isolated. It was a reflection of something many lived but few survived with their dignity intact. She moved through the world with a quiet grace, acknowledging the recognition with humility, but never letting it redefine her core. The elderly woman who once believed that justice came automatically to those who followed the rules had been fundamentally changed. Not broken, but evolved. She no longer carried naive faith in the fairness of systems. She carried a sharper truth, that justice, when it comes, often arrives not by design but by disruption. And now, she intended to be that disruption, not through anger or spectacle, but through presence and unwavering persistence. One afternoon, she was invited to a private roundtable hosted by a coalition of public defenders, civil rights attorneys, and former wrongfully accused individuals. Though hesitant at first, Jessica agreed, not to speak, but to listen. What she heard broke her heart and strengthened her resolve. Stories of teenage boys mistaken for criminals because of their clothes. Single mothers jailed over unpaid fines. Elderly immigrants detained without cause. It was not just her story, it was everywhere. And suddenly, she realized that her survival wasn't the end of her chapter, it was the beginning of a responsibility. From that day forward, she quietly began to mentor others, not in a formal sense, but through tea-stained letters, soft phone calls, long porch conversations. She taught them not how to fight the system as it stood, but how to outlast it, how to remain human inside its machinery. Her strength didn't come from shouting, it came from standing still, from being the calm eye of a storm that refused to pass. Meanwhile, Jamal's initiatives were gaining momentum, inspired in part by his mother's ordeal. He pushed for policies mandating video review before charges could be filed, launched a task force to monitor prosecutorial misconduct, and fought for community review boards to oversee local law enforcement. Though criticized by some for being too personal, Jamal never backed down. Justice became personal the moment my mother was treated like a criminal for shopping, he declared in one heated interview. And when asked if his policies were emotional, he replied, "Emotion is not the enemy of justice. Indifference is." Jessica watched from the sidelines with quiet pride, not in the position her son held, but in the heart he carried. She never tried to shape his message, but her story had already become its foundation. She began to notice small changes around her, signs in grocery stores that read, "All customers deserve respect." Young officers offering softer gazes. Cashiers making eye contact instead of assumptions. The world was not transformed overnight, but she could feel the ripples. One evening, as she walked past the community library, she saw her own face on a poster beside the words, "Every voice matters." It wasn't for a book or event, it was simply acknowledgement. And strangely, she didn't feel exploited, she felt seen. Later that week, she received a letter from a law student in Chicago who had been inspired by her case to pursue criminal justice reform. The student wrote, "Your silence in the courtroom spoke louder than any protest I've ever attended. You showed me that justice isn't always loud, it's enduring." Jessica smiled, folded the letter neatly, and placed it inside a wooden box where she kept handwritten memories of this unexpected chapter. That night, with the city glowing beyond her window and the hum of traffic like a lullaby, she allowed herself a rare indulgence, hope. Not the blind kind she once had, but a mature, weathered kind, the kind built from pain, reflection, and action. She closed her eyes and thought of the girl in the holding cell, the frightened cashier, the trembling man at church, the students learning her name not as a victim, but as a voice. Jessica Carter, once accused, once invisible, was now a quiet revolution wrapped in grace. She didn't seek to be remembered, only to be useful, and in that, she found something deeper than vindication. She found meaning. In the quiet dawn of a new year, Jessica Carter stood by her window, watching the mist rise from the city streets like memories returning from deep sleep. It had been over a year since that fateful day at the grocery store. A day that shattered her illusions and reshaped her identity in ways she was still learning to understand. Life had settled into a strange rhythm, peaceful on the outside, but transformed within. Her name was now known in places she had never stepped foot in, discussed in universities, cited in law reviews, shared in social justice documentaries. But Jessica had never asked for that. She had only wanted to buy milk and bread. Now, her face had become part of a larger dialogue, and though she had no desire for fame, she realized that stories like hers carried a strange kind of gravity. They pulled people together, forced uncomfortable truths into the light, and sometimes, even inspired action. She still lived in the same house, drank the same brand of tea, and tended her plants every morning. But beneath the surface, she had become something else, a quiet force. Her days were often filled with letters, messages, and visitors, many of them women who had felt powerless, judged, and discarded by systems designed to fail them. Jessica never preached, she listened. She offered soft words, knowing glances, and a kind of wisdom that didn't come from books but from surviving what tried to erase her. In one letter, a young girl wrote, "You made me believe I could still matter, even after everything." Jessica folded that note and placed it in the same wooden box where she kept the courtroom sketch, her booking slip, and a printed news headline that read, "Mother of U.S. Attorney General speaks truth to power without saying a word." Meanwhile, Jamal continued to rise in influence, his voice carrying across Senate floors and policy briefings. But he never lost sight of his roots. Every decision he made now seemed tethered to a deeper understanding, not just of the law, but of the lives it affected. He would often call his mother late at night, seeking her thoughts, her calm clarity, even if she didn't always say much. She had become his compass. One evening, he asked her, "Do you ever wish it hadn't happened?" She paused, then answered, "I wish the world didn't need it to happen to listen." That truth sat heavy between them, because they both knew it was not just her suffering that sparked change, it was her connection to him. And that reality, while painful, had become the shared fuel. Jessica never returned to Mike's Market. She couldn't, not out of fear, but because it no longer felt like hers. The aisles had become symbols of betrayal and silence. Instead, she shopped at a co-op run by local women, where people greeted her by name and often handed her small notes tucked into her bag. Some were thank you cards. Others were cries for help. She read every one. At night, she often wrote back, sealing envelopes with a small smile and a hope that her words would find the right hearts. She had no foundation, no non-profit, no official platform, just her kitchen table, her memory, and the truth. And somehow, that was enough. She was invited to galas, to political gatherings, to awards ceremonies, but she rarely went. Let others take the microphone. She'd say, "My voice is needed elsewhere." But she never dismissed the power of visibility. She allowed her story to be told in a short film produced by young black filmmakers, giving them full creative control. When she watched it at a small community screening, surrounded by neighbors and strangers alike, she wept, not because of the pain, but because they got it right. They showed her not as a victim, but as a woman who stood still while the world collapsed around her, and still rose. As the seasons turned, she began mentoring teenage girls through a community program. They came to her nervous, defensive, unsure, and left with lifted chins and firmer steps. She didn't give them answers, she gave them mirrors. "You are not broken," she'd tell them. "You were simply made to believe you were." By the time spring rolled in, Jessica had planted a small garden in her yard, a patch of green in the middle of concrete and glass. She called it her Justice Garden, not because it represented the system, but because it showed what could grow after something is buried. In the stillness of early morning, among lavender and sage, Jessica Carter found peace, not in forgetting what happened, but in using it, not in being remembered, but in reminding others they still had power. And every bloom, every leaf, every root reaching for sunlight was a testament that even in the most hardened soil, hope could grow. By the second spring since her arrest, Jessica Carter no longer measured her life in headlines or interviews but in moments, quiet, Steady, deeply human moments that reminded her of who she was before the world took notice. The garden she had planted, now lush with color and purpose, had become a sanctuary not just for herself, but for the people who found their way to her gate. Mothers came with stories of wrongful evictions. Teenage boys dropped by with questions about life and justice, and former inmates stood silently in her yard, unsure of what to say, but grateful to be standing on ground tended by someone who had stood where they once had. Jessica greeted each of them the same way, with open hands, open eyes, and a stillness that made space for their pain. She had learned, in the months following her trial, that healing wasn't loud. It didn't march or roar. It whispered. It planted seeds. It sat beside you in silence until the shaking stopped. And so she gave that kind of healing to others, never claiming the role of savior, never calling herself an activist. She was just a woman who had seen the truth up close and decided she would never look away again. Her home became a kind of informal gathering place. Neighbors brought folding chairs. Students brought notebooks, and sometimes Jamal would join when his schedule allowed, sitting humbly among the circle as just another person trying to understand. He no longer introduced himself with titles. Here, he was simply Jessica's son. And she, the woman who had once worried about burdening him with her story, now watched him with pride as he carried it into every room of power he entered, not as a badge of pain, but as a sword of purpose. One afternoon, Jessica received a letter from a retired judge who had anonymously followed her case. He admitted, in carefully chosen words, that what had happened to her had forced him to re-examine years of rulings. Years of subtle biases he had never acknowledged. "I wish I could go back," he wrote. Jessica stared at those words for a long time. She didn't feel anger, only a kind of bittersweet ache for all the people who never received such admissions. "Still," she wrote back. "You can't go back," she replied, "but you can speak now. That matters too." And he did. A few weeks later, that same judge delivered a public statement supporting legal reforms Jessica had quietly advocated for, finally adding a voice that once held silence. Change, she was learning, did not always come in waves. Sometimes it came like water seeping through stone, slow, persistent, undeniable, and though she knew the system still failed many, she also knew that every voice lifted, every truth told, created cracks in its foundation. Sometimes, late at night, when the city had gone quiet, Jessica would walk barefoot through her garden and speak to the soil, not out of superstition, but because it reminded her that everything beautiful had once been buried. She no longer flinched at sirens. She no longer held her breath when entering public spaces. Her fear had not disappeared, but it had been reshaped into something stronger: awareness, vigilance, resolve. She didn't forgive the officer who arrested her. She didn't forget the judge who nearly condemned her. But she refused to carry their actions as her own weight. That burden belonged to them. Her role now was to live fully and truthfully, to be the woman she had always been beneath the trauma, patient, wise, resilient. One morning, as she tended to her lavender, a small girl walked up to her fence with wide eyes and said, "My mama says you're famous." Jessica chuckled softly, wiped her hands on her apron, and knelt beside the girl. "Famous people wear fancy shoes," she said. "I just grow things." The girl smiled and asked, "Can I grow things too?" And in that instant, Jessica saw the clearest vision of what legacy truly meant. Not a name etched in law books or chanted in protests, but a child believing she could plant something, tend it, and watch it bloom. That was the revolution. That was the quiet power no one could ever take away again. And as the wind moved through her garden and the city hummed beyond the hedges, Jessica Carter stood tall, not as a victim, not even as a survivor, but as a keeper of roots, a gardener of justice, and a woman who had turned her pain into a place where others could finally breathe.